The small town of Willow Creek was known for its quiet streets, sprawling fields, and the kind of close-knit community where everyone knew each other's names. It was a place where life moved slowly, almost predictably, until tragedy struck. The Harper family. Thomas Harper, the eldest son, had been the heart of their home, a bright, ambitious young man with dreams bigger than the town itself. At just 24 years old, he seemed destined for greatness, but fate had other plans. One fateful evening, Thomas collapsed unexpectedly while working on one of his many projects in the garage. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The official cause of death was listed as a sudden cardiac arrhythmia, though no one could explain why such a healthy young man would fall victim to something so rare. In the days that followed, grief settled over the Harper household like a thick fog. His mother, Margaret, struggled to keep herself together, often retreating into silence as she tried to process the loss of her firstborn. Her husband had passed away years earlier, leaving her to raise two boys alone. Now, with Thomas gone, the weight of raising 15-year-old Daniel felt heavier than ever. For Daniel, the absence of his older brother left an unfillable void. Thomas had always been more than just a sibling. He was a mentor, a confidant, and sometimes even a father figure. Without him, Daniel felt adrift, unsure of how to navigate life without the person who had always guided him. Friends and neighbors offered condolences, bringing casseroles and flowers, but none of it eased the pain that clung stubbornly to the Harper family. As weeks turned into months, the initial shock began to give way to a dull ache. Life in Willow Creek resumed its usual rhythm, but for Margaret and Daniel, things were far from normal. Margaret found herself staring at photographs of Thomas, replaying memories in her mind, as if trying to hold on to him a little longer. She avoided going into his room, unable to face the piles of books, tools, and half-finished projects scattered across his desk. Daniel, on the other hand, couldn't stay away. He spent hours sitting on Thomas's bed, flipping through old notebooks and sketchbooks filled with ideas that now seemed frozen in time. Sometimes he'd talk aloud to his brother, sharing things he thought Thomas might have wanted to hear. "I got an A on my math test," he'd say softly, or "Coach says I'm improving at soccer." These one-sided conversations brought him comfort, even if they also reminded him of everything he'd lost. But then strange things started happening, things neither Margaret nor Daniel could easily explain. It began with dreams. Vivid, haunting dreams that felt less like figments of imagination and more like visits from another world. In these dreams, Thomas appeared as clear as day, speaking to Daniel in a voice that echoed with urgency. "There's something you need to know," he'd say, his expression serious. "Something isn't right." Each time Daniel woke up, he felt disoriented, as though he'd been pulled abruptly out of a different reality. At first, he tried to dismiss the dreams as products of grief, a subconscious attempt to keep Thomas alive in some form. But the frequency and intensity of the dreams only grew stronger. They became harder to ignore, especially when Thomas began repeating the same phrase, "You need to dig." Margaret noticed changes in her son almost immediately. He seemed distracted during meals, barely touching his food as if preoccupied by something weighing heavily on his mind. When she asked what was wrong, Daniel hesitated, unsure of how to explain. How could he tell her about the dreams, about the feeling gnawing at him, urging him to act on something so bizarre? Finally, one rainy evening, after weeks of internal struggle, Daniel decided he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. Sitting across from his mother at the kitchen table, he took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "Mom, I think we need to dig up Thomas's grave." Margaret froze, her spoon suspended midair as she stared at her son in disbelief. For a moment, she wondered if she'd misheard him. Surely Daniel didn't mean what she thought he did. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He explained the dreams, the vividness, the clarity, the way Thomas spoke to him as if he were standing right there. "It's not just random," he insisted. He keeps telling me there's something wrong, something unfinished, and every time I wake up it feels real. Margaret listened intently, torn between dismissing the idea as irrational and acknowledging the desperation in her son's eyes. She wanted to believe it was simply grief manifesting in unusual ways, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was truth to what Daniel was saying. That night, long after Daniel had gone to bed, Margaret sat alone in the living room staring blankly at the flickering television screen. Her thoughts raced as she replayed their conversation over and over again. Was it possible? Could Thomas really be communicating with Daniel from beyond the grave? Or was this just a coping mechanism, a way for her son to deal with the overwhelming loss? No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a logical explanation for the dreams, or for the certainty in Daniel's voice. Eventually, exhaustion won out and she drifted off to sleep, only to wake up hours later with a start. As dawn broke outside, casting pale light through the curtains, Margaret came to a decision. Whether it made sense or not, whether it was rational or absurd, she owed it to her son, and perhaps to Thomas, to investigate further. If digging up the grave was what Daniel believed they needed to do, then she would help him see it through. Over the next few days, Margaret wrestled with guilt and fear, knowing full well the implications of what they were planning. Disturbing a grave wasn't something taken lightly, especially in a town like Willow Creek where traditions ran deep. Yet, as much as she dreaded the consequences, she couldn't ignore the growing conviction within her. Perhaps it wasn't just Daniel being driven by the dreams. Perhaps she too felt compelled by forces she didn't fully understand. Together, they devised a plan. Margaret reached out to an old friend named Mr. Grayson, who worked in cemetery maintenance. Though hesitant at first, Mr. Grayson agreed to assist them discreetly, understanding the delicate nature of their request. On a cold November evening, under the cover of darkness, they met at the cemetery gates, armed with shovels and a shared sense of trepidation. Neither of them knew exactly what they were looking for or what they might find, but one thing was certain: whatever lay beneath the ground, it held answers that could change their lives forever. The night they chose to exhume Thomas's grave was cold and moonless, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. Margaret, Daniel, and Mr. Grayson arrived at the cemetery just after midnight, their footsteps muffled by the damp grass beneath their shoes. The air smelled faintly of earth and decay, a reminder of where they stood and what they were about to do. Margaret clutched her coat tightly around herself, not because she was cold, though the chill seeped into her bones, but because she needed something to hold on to, some anchor to keep her grounded in this surreal moment. Daniel walked beside her, his face pale but determined, clutching a flashlight he hadn't yet turned on. They approached the grave quietly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness of the surrounding headstones. Thomas's grave was marked by a simple stone, engraved, with his name and dates. It looked like any other plot in the cemetery, yet to Daniel and Margaret it felt different, charged with an energy neither could quite explain. As Mr. Grayson began digging, the sound of the shovel slicing through soil echoed loudly in the silence, each scrape reverberating like a heartbeat. Margaret glanced nervously over her shoulder, half expecting someone to appear and stop them. She knew they were breaking rules, crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, but she pushed those thoughts aside. This wasn't about legality or tradition anymore. It was about finding answers. For Daniel, it was even more personal. He knelt near the edge of the grave, watching intently as dirt was shoveled away, his mind racing with questions. What would they find? Would it confirm his dreams or shatter them completely? Hours passed, though it felt like mere minutes. Finally, the shovel struck wood, a hollow thud resonating through the quiet night. Margaret's breath hitched, and she instinctively reached for Daniel's hand. Together, they watched as Mr. Grayson cleared the last bits of earth, revealing the coffin beneath. It was smaller than either of them had imagined, its surface smooth and unremarkable. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of what they were doing pressed down on them like a physical force. Then slowly, Mr. Grayson pried open the lid. The creak of the hinges sounded impossibly loud, cutting through the stillness like a scream. Inside, instead of Thomas, they found stacks of papers, envelopes tied with string, and several small wooden boxes. No body, no remains, just objects. Margaret staggered back, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he climbed into the grave, ignoring the dirt clinging to his clothes, and began examining the contents. His hand shook as he picked up one of the envelopes, turning it over to see his mother's name written neatly on the front. Nearby lay another addressed to him. Beside the letters were notebooks, their pages filled with Thomas's familiar handwriting. Sketches of machines and diagrams covered the margins, accompanied by notes scrawled hastily in pencil. There were also the wooden boxes, each slightly larger than the palm of his hand. One of them caught Daniel's eye, a plain, unadorned box with a tiny keyhole. Tucked inside was a key attached to a folded slip of paper. When Daniel unfolded it, he read the message aloud. "For Dan, when you're ready." Mr. Grayson stepped back, visibly uneasy. "I think I should go," he muttered, glancing nervously at the items scattered across the coffin. Margaret nodded absently, too overwhelmed to argue. After thanking him profusely, she helped Daniel gather everything before sending him on his way. Alone now, mother and son sat cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by the strange artifacts from Thomas's grave. Margaret stared at the pile of belongings, tears streaming silently down her face. "Why would he leave all this here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel shrugged, his own emotions churning beneath the surface. He wanted to believe there was a reason, a purpose behind it all, but right now, it only added to the confusion. Still, he couldn't deny the sense of urgency building within him. Whatever Thomas had left behind, it was meant for them to find and to understand. Back home, they spread out the contents on the dining table, lit by the soft glow of a single overhead lamp. The house was eerily silent except for the occasional creak of floorboards as they shifted positions. Margaret started with the envelopes, carefully opening the one addressed to her. Inside was a letter written in Thomas's neat script. She read it aloud, her voice cracking as she spoke. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means my plan worked, or at least part of it did. I know how hard it must have been for you to come here tonight, but trust me, this isn't about death, it's about life. Everything I've left behind is meant to help you and Daniel move forward. Please don't grieve for me. Instead, use what I've given you to build something better." Margaret paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at Daniel, who was already poring over one of the notebooks. "He sounds so alive," she murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. Daniel flipped through page after page, marveling at the complexity of Thomas's ideas. There were blueprints for solar-powered generators, detailed instructions for creating sustainable farming systems, and even rough drafts of business proposals aimed at reducing carbon emissions. Some of the concepts were far beyond anything Daniel understood, but others sparked a flicker of recognition. He remembered Thomas talking excitedly about renewable energy during family dinners, his eyes lighting up as he described his vision for a greener future. At the time, Daniel hadn't fully grasped the significance of his brother's words, but now, staring at the evidence laid out before him, it all made sense. Thomas hadn't just been dreaming, he'd been planning. Planning for a world he hoped to improve, even if he wouldn't live to see it happen. As the hours ticked by, Daniel eventually turned his attention to the wooden box with the keyhole. Holding the key in his hand, he hesitated, suddenly unsure whether he was ready to open it. Margaret noticed his hesitation and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "Whatever's inside, we'll figure it out together." Taking a deep breath, Daniel inserted the key and turned it. The lid clicked open, revealing a USB drive nestled inside. Attached to it was another note, this one shorter but equally cryptic. "This is my legacy. Use it wisely." Daniel held the drive up to the light, studying it as if it might reveal its secrets without needing to be plugged in. But curiosity got the better of him, and soon he was rushing upstairs to his computer. When the files on the USB drive loaded, both Daniel and Margaret leaned in, captivated by what they saw. Document after document appeared on the screen, detailing projects Thomas had been working on in secret. There were spreadsheets outlining funding strategies, marketing plans for inventions he'd designed, and heartfelt messages meant specifically for Daniel. In one file, Thomas wrote, "Little bro, I always knew you'd be the one to carry the torch. You're stronger than you realize, smarter than you give yourself credit for. Don't let fear stop you from chasing your dreams. Or mine." Reading those words, Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time since Thomas's death, he didn't feel consumed by sadness. Instead, he felt inspired, determined. Like maybe, just maybe, he could honor his brother's memory by bringing his ideas to life. Over the next few days, Daniel threw himself into understanding Thomas's work. With Margaret's help, he began sorting through the materials, organizing them into categories based on priority and feasibility. They discovered that many of Thomas's projects were not only innovative, but also practical, capable of making a real difference in the community. Margaret suggested reaching out to local organizations and businesses to gauge interest in collaborating, while Daniel focused on refining the designs and calculations. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, times when they doubted their ability to follow through, but they kept pushing forward. Slowly but surely, they started to piece together a roadmap for turning Thomas's dreams into reality. Meanwhile, word of their discovery began to spread throughout Willow Creek. Neighbors who had once offered condolences now came knocking with offers of support. Some volunteered their expertise, others donated resources, and a few even pledged financial backing. What started as a private mission between mother and son quickly grew into a collective effort fueled by love, admiration, and respect for Thomas Harper. Even Mr. Grayson, who had initially been reluctant to get involved, returned to apologize and offer his assistance. "Your boy had a good heart," he told Margaret one afternoon, his weathered face softening. "And it looks like he passed that goodness on to you too." By the end of the year, Daniel and Margaret had transformed Thomas's ideas into tangible action. A prototype for one of his energy-efficient devices was showcased at a regional science fair, earning widespread praise and sparking interest from investors. Plans for a community garden powered entirely by renewable energy were underway, thanks to grants secured through Margaret's networking efforts, and Daniel, once lost in grief, found renewed purpose in carrying forward his brother's legacy. He spoke openly about Thomas's influence, encouraging others to pursue their passions despite obstacles. "My brother taught me that life doesn't end when you do," he said during a school assembly. "It continues through the people you touch and the dreams you inspire." As the weeks turned into months, the Harper household transformed from a place of mourning into a hub of activity. Margaret and Daniel worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of Thomas's vision with a determination that surprised even themselves. The dining table, once cluttered with remnants of grief, now served as a makeshift office filled with papers, blueprints, and laptops. Every evening after school, Daniel would sit down with his mother to review progress, brainstorm solutions, and divide tasks for the next day. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were disagreements, moments of doubt, and technical hurdles they didn't know how to overcome, but neither of them gave up. They had made a silent pact to honor Thomas's memory by seeing his ideas through, no matter how challenging the journey became. One of the first breakthroughs came when Daniel stumbled upon a folder labeled Project Lumina on the USB drive. Inside were detailed instructions for building a compact solar-powered lamp, designed specifically for rural areas without access to electricity. The concept was simple yet revolutionary. Lightweight, affordable, and easy to assemble using locally available materials. Intrigued, Daniel brought the idea to his science teacher, Mr. Carter, who immediately recognized its potential. "This could change lives," Mr. Carter said, running his fingers over the design sketches. With his guidance, Daniel formed a small team of classmates eager to help bring Project Lumina to life. Together, they spent countless hours in the school workshop, soldering circuits, testing prototypes, and troubleshooting issues. When the first working model finally lit up, a soft, steady glow illuminating the room, everyone cheered. It felt like more than just an invention. It felt like proof that Thomas's legacy was alive and thriving. Meanwhile, Margaret focused her efforts on reaching out to local organizations and businesses. She drafted emails, attended community meetings, and knocked on doors, explaining the scope of Thomas's work and seeking partnerships. At first, responses were lukewarm. Some people dismissed the projects as too ambitious or impractical, while others simply didn't have the resources to contribute. But Margaret refused to be discouraged. She remembered something Thomas used to say: "If you believe in something hard enough, the world will start believing with you." Armed with that mantra, she persisted, sharing stories about Thomas's passion and dedication until skeptics began to see the value in his ideas. One breakthrough came when a retired engineer named Mr. Peterson offered to mentor Daniel and his team. Another followed when a local hardware store donated supplies for Project Lumina. Slowly but surely, momentum began to build. The turning point came during Willow Creek's annual Harvest Festival, a beloved tradition that drew crowds from neighboring towns. Margaret convinced the organizing committee to let her set up a booth showcasing Thomas's projects. On the day of the festival, Daniel stood nervously behind the display, clutching a prototype of the solar lamp in one hand and a stack of flyers in the other. He watched as families browsed the stalls selling homemade jams, hand-knitted scarves, and pumpkin pies, wondering if anyone would stop to listen. Then, a young girl approached, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Look, Mommy." "A sun lamp," she exclaimed, pointing excitedly at the glowing device. Her curiosity sparked interest among passers-by, and soon a small crowd gathered around Daniel's booth. As he explained the purpose and functionality of the lamp, he saw awe and admiration reflected in their eyes. By the end of the day, dozens of people had signed up to support Project Lumina, offering everything from funding to volunteer work. Encouraged by the positive response, Daniel and Margaret decided to expand their outreach efforts. They created a website featuring Thomas's designs, accompanied by heartfelt testimonials from family, friends, and collaborators. Social media posts highlighting the story behind Project Lumina went viral, drawing attention not only from within Willow Creek, but also from farther afield. Environmental activists praised the initiative, while educators incorporated it into lesson plans about sustainability and innovation. Local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing Thomas a visionary, ahead of his time. For Margaret, reading these articles was bittersweet. She took pride in knowing her son's brilliance was being recognized, yet she couldn't help but wish he were here to witness it himself. Still, she found solace in the fact that his work was inspiring others to dream bigger and act bolder. Amid the growing excitement, Daniel faced a personal challenge. Balancing schoolwork, extracurricular activities, and Project Lumina proved overwhelming at times. There were nights when he stayed up late poring over calculations, only to fall asleep at his desk. His grades slipped slightly, earning him concerned looks from teachers and classmates alike. Margaret noticed the toll it was taking on him and gently suggested scaling back. "You're doing amazing things, sweetheart," she told him one evening, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "But you can't pour from an empty cup. Take care of yourself first." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed to delegate some responsibilities to his teammates, trusting them to carry part of the load. To his surprise, stepping back a little didn't diminish his involvement. It strengthened it. Watching others take ownership of the project reignited his enthusiasm, reminding him that collaboration was key to success. As winter approached, another aspect of Thomas's legacy came to light: his passion for sustainable agriculture. Among the files on the USB drive was a comprehensive plan for creating a self-sustaining community garden, powered entirely by renewable energy. The blueprint included rainwater harvesting systems, composting techniques, and vertical farming methods, designed to maximize yield in limited spaces. Inspired, Margaret proposed transforming an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town into the envisioned garden. With permission from the city council and backing from local environmental groups, construction began in early December. Volunteers of all ages pitched in, clearing debris, planting seeds, and installing solar panels. Daniel joined them whenever he could, marveling at how quickly the barren land transformed into a vibrant oasis. Seeing the project come to life filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. By spring, both Project Lumina and the community garden were well underway, garnering widespread acclaim. The solar lamps had been distributed to several rural villages, providing much-needed light for students studying after dark and families gathering indoors. Feedback poured in from grateful recipients, many of whom shared photos and videos of the lamps in use. Meanwhile, the garden flourished, producing fresh vegetables and herbs that were donated to food banks and shelters. What started as a tribute to Thomas had evolved into a movement empowering entire communities. People often remarked on the irony that a tragedy had given birth to so much hope. But for Daniel and Margaret, there was no irony. They saw it as a testament to Thomas's enduring spirit, a reminder that even in death, love and creativity could flourish. Despite the successes, Daniel sometimes struggled with feelings of inadequacy. He worried that he wasn't living up to Thomas's standards, that he lacked the brilliance and drive that defined his brother. These doubts surfaced most acutely during quiet moments, when the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Sensing his turmoil, Margaret sat him down one afternoon and shared a story he'd never heard before. "When your brother was your age," she began, "he failed a math test so badly that he cried for hours. He thought he wasn't smart enough, that he'd never amount to anything. But look where he ended up. Do you know why? Because he kept going. He didn't let setbacks define him, and neither should you." Her words struck a chord deep within Daniel, helping him realize that perfection wasn't the goal. Perseverance was. As summer rolled around, Daniel prepared to present Project Lumina at a regional science fair. The event attracted participants from across the state, each competing for scholarships, internships, and recognition. Nervous but determined, Daniel stood beside his display, explaining the intricacies of the solar lamp to judges and spectators alike. When the award ceremony arrived, he barely paid attention, assuming his chances were slim against older, more experienced competitors. So when his name was called as the winner of the Innovation Award, he froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Margaret's voice broke through his daze. "Go on, sweetheart, that's you." Beaming, he walked to the stage, accepting the trophy amidst thunderous applause. Holding it aloft, he dedicated the win to Thomas, thanking him for leaving behind a legacy worth fighting for. Back home, surrounded by loved ones celebrating the victory, Daniel reflected on how far they'd come. From the lonely days following Thomas's death to the bustling household buzzing with purpose, their lives had undergone a profound transformation. Margaret hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Your brother would be so proud of you," she whispered. Daniel nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Though Thomas was gone, his presence lingered, in the laughter filling their home, in the projects changing lives, and in the unwavering bond between mother and son. For the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future, bright with possibilities. Thomas may have planted the seeds, but it was up to them to nurture the garden. And nurture it they would, with courage, resilience, and boundless hope. The regional science fair victory marked a turning point for Daniel and Margaret, propelling them into a new phase of their journey. News of Project Lumina's success spread beyond Willow Creek, attracting attention from organizations and individuals far beyond their small town. Environmental advocates praised the initiative as a model for sustainable innovation, while educators highlighted it as an example of how young minds could tackle global challenges. Invitations to speak at conferences and workshops began pouring in, along with requests for interviews and collaborations. For Daniel, who had spent most of his life in the shadow of his older brother, this sudden spotlight was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He found himself fielding questions about Thomas's vision, explaining the technical details of the solar lamp, and sharing stories that painted a picture of the man behind the ideas. Each time he spoke, he felt closer to Thomas, not as a distant memory but as a living force guiding him forward. Margaret, too, embraced her role in promoting Thomas's legacy. She became the backbone of their efforts, managing logistics, coordinating volunteers, and ensuring that every aspect of the projects ran smoothly. Her days were filled with phone calls, emails, and meetings, yet she never seemed tired. If anything, she appeared more alive than she had in years. Friends often remarked on the change in her demeanor, noting how her eyes sparkled when she talked about the garden or the solar lamps. "I feel like I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to do," she told a neighbor one afternoon, her voice brimming with conviction. It wasn't just about honoring Thomas anymore. It was about creating something meaningful, something that would outlast them all. One of the most unexpected developments came when a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Ellis reached out to Margaret. Sarah had stumbled upon the story of Project Lumina online and was captivated by its origins. She proposed creating a short film chronicling the Harper family's journey, from the mysterious discovery at the grave to the transformative impact of Thomas's work. At first, Margaret hesitated, unsure if they were ready to share such a deeply personal story with the world. But Daniel encouraged her, reminding her of Thomas's belief in inspiring others. "This isn't just our story," he said. "It's a story that can help people see what's possible." With renewed resolve, Margaret agreed, and filming began shortly after. The process of making the documentary brought back a flood of emotions for both mother and son. They revisited old memories, recounting moments of grief, confusion, and eventual triumph. Sarah captured everything: the quiet tears shed during interviews, the laughter shared over dinner, the determination etched on Daniel's face as he worked on new prototypes. She also filmed scenes of the community garden, capturing volunteers tending to plants under the warm spring sun, and followed Daniel as he demonstrated the solar lamp to curious children in rural areas. By the time the final cut was completed, the documentary was more than just a retelling of events. It was a tribute to resilience, creativity, and the power of love to transcend even death itself. When the documentary premiered at a local theater, the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. The auditorium was packed with friends, neighbors, and strangers alike, all eager to witness the story that had captured hearts across the region. As the screen lit up with images of Thomas's sketches, Daniel's prototypes, and Margaret's unwavering dedication, the audience was drawn into a narrative that felt both intimate and universal. There were audible gasps when the scene showing the exhumation of Thomas's grave appeared, followed by murmurs of disbelief and wonder. By the end, many in the crowd were wiping away tears, moved not only by the Harpers' courage but also by the realization that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. The positive reception of the documentary opened doors Daniel and Margaret hadn't anticipated. A nonprofit organization specializing in sustainable development offered to partner with them, providing funding and resources to scale up Project Lumina and expand the community garden initiative. Universities invited Daniel to speak at engineering symposiums, where professors marveled at his ability to translate complex concepts into practical solutions. Even companies approached him with offers of internships and scholarships, eager to nurture his talent. Despite the opportunities, Daniel remained grounded, always crediting Thomas for the inspiration behind his achievements. "He gave me the tools," he said during one speech. "All I did was use them." As summer unfolded, Daniel threw himself into refining the solar lamp design, incorporating feedback from users and experts alike. One suggestion stood out: adding a USB charging port to the device, allowing it to power small electronics like phones and radios. Excited by the idea, Daniel enlisted the help of Mr. Peterson, the retired engineer, to bring it to life. Together, they spent hours in the workshop, testing circuits and tweaking components until the upgraded version met their exacting standards. When the first prototype powered on successfully, Daniel couldn't contain his excitement. "This is it," he exclaimed, holding the lamp aloft. "We're making history." Meanwhile, Margaret focused on expanding the reach of the community garden. With support from the nonprofit partner, they acquired additional land and installed advanced irrigation systems powered by solar energy. Workshops were organized to teach locals sustainable farming techniques, empowering them to grow their own food and reduce dependency on imported goods. The garden became more than just a source of fresh produce. It evolved into a symbol of unity and self-reliance. Families gathered there on weekends, swapping recipes and sharing meals made from the harvest. Children played among the rows of vegetables, learning valuable lessons about nature and conservation. For Margaret, watching the garden thrive was a source of immense pride. It reminded her of Thomas's dream, a world where communities worked together to create abundance out of scarcity. Despite their successes, challenges continued to arise. Funding shortages occasionally threatened to derail progress, forcing Margaret and Daniel to get creative with fundraising campaigns. Technical glitches delayed production timelines, requiring long nights troubleshooting problems. And then there were the skeptics, those who dismissed their efforts as naive idealism or questioned whether the projects could truly make a lasting impact. But each obstacle only strengthened their resolve. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from shared memories of Thomas and the knowledge that they were building something greater than themselves. One particularly poignant moment occurred during a visit to a remote village where the solar lamps had been distributed. Daniel and Margaret traveled there to assess their effectiveness and gather feedback from residents. As they walked through narrow dirt paths lined with modest homes, they saw firsthand how the lamps had transformed daily life. In one household, a young girl sat hunched over a textbook, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. Her mother explained that before receiving the device, the family relied on kerosene lanterns, which were expensive and hazardous. Now her daughter could study safely into the night, improving her chances of excelling in school. Hearing these stories reaffirmed Daniel and Margaret's belief in the importance of their work. They weren't just creating gadgets or growing vegetables. They were changing lives. Back home, the Harper household buzzed with activity as preparations for the next phase of expansion got underway. Plans were drafted for a larger manufacturing facility to produce the solar lamps. Partnerships were forged with international aid organizations, and outreach programs were developed to educate underserved communities about renewable energy. Daniel juggled his responsibilities with schoolwork, often staying up late to finish assignments before diving back into project-related tasks. Margaret balanced administrative duties with public speaking engagements, traveling to nearby towns to share their story and rally support. Though their schedules were demanding, neither complained. They knew they were part of something bigger than themselves, something that would endure long after they were gone. As autumn approached, bringing with it crisp air and golden leaves, Daniel reflected on how much had changed since that fateful night at the cemetery. What began as a desperate search for answers had blossomed into a movement touching countless lives. He thought about Thomas often, imagining how proud his brother would be to see what they'd accomplished. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit in Thomas's old room surrounded by sketches and notebooks and talk aloud as if his brother were still there. "We did it," he'd say softly. "Your dreams are coming true." Though he missed Thomas dearly, he no longer felt consumed by sadness. Instead, he felt connected to him in ways he never imagined possible. Margaret, too, found solace in the journey. The pain of losing Thomas would always linger, but it no longer defined her. She had rediscovered purpose, channeling her grief into action and finding joy in the ripple effect of their work. Watching Daniel grow into a confident, compassionate young man filled her with pride. She saw glimpses of Thomas in him, the same determination, the same passion for making the world a better place. And though she knew Thomas couldn't physically be there, she felt his presence in every milestone they achieved, every life they touched. By the time winter arrived, blanketing Willow Creek in snow, Daniel and Margaret stood side by side at the edge of as winter deepened. Daniel and Margaret found themselves reflecting not just on the past year, but also on the road ahead. The momentum they had built was undeniable, yet it came with its own set of challenges. Scaling up their initiatives required more than passion. It demanded meticulous planning, consistent effort, and a willingness to adapt. For Daniel, this meant stepping into roles he never imagined for himself, negotiating contracts, managing budgets, and leading teams. Margaret, meanwhile, took charge of fostering relationships with donors, coordinating logistics, and ensuring that every decision aligned with Thomas's original vision. Despite the weight of these responsibilities, neither faltered. They were driven by a shared understanding. What they were building wasn't just for them. It was for everyone who believed in a better future. One of the biggest hurdles came when they began constructing the new manufacturing facility for the solar lamps. Securing permits proved to be a bureaucratic nightmare, with paperwork piling up faster than they could process it. Local officials were supportive in theory but hesitant in practice, citing zoning laws and environmental regulations as potential roadblocks. Frustrated but undeterred, Margaret enlisted the help of a lawyer specializing in nonprofit ventures. Together, they navigated the maze of legal requirements, attending meetings and submitting appeals until they finally received approval. Meanwhile, Daniel focused on designing the layout of the facility, working closely with engineers to ensure efficiency and sustainability. He insisted that the building itself should embody the principles behind Project Lumina, powered entirely by renewable energy, constructed with eco-friendly materials and designed to minimize waste. When the foundation was laid in early January, it felt like laying the groundwork for something monumental. While the facility took shape, Margaret turned her attention to expanding the community garden initiative. With funding from their nonprofit partner, they acquired additional plots of land and introduced advanced farming techniques such as aquaponics and vertical gardening. These methods allowed them to maximize yield while conserving resources, making the project scalable for other communities facing similar challenges. To spread awareness, they launched an educational program aimed at teaching sustainable practices to schools and local organizations. Volunteers led workshops on composting, rainwater harvesting, and crop rotation, empowering participants to implement these strategies in their own lives. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds signing up to learn and contribute. Margaret often stood back watching as people worked side by side, planting seeds and sharing stories. It reminded her of Thomas's belief in collaboration, the idea that progress happens when individuals come together for a common cause. Daniel, too, embraced opportunities to inspire others. Invitations to speak at conferences and universities continued to pour in, taking him to cities far beyond Willow Creek. At each event, he shared not only the technical aspects of Project Lumina, but also the emotional journey that fueled it. Audiences listened intently as he recounted the dreams that guided him, the doubts that tested his resolve, and the moments of triumph that kept him going. His authenticity resonated deeply, earning him standing ovations and heartfelt messages from attendees. One letter written by a high school student named Emily stood out. "Your story made me realize I don't have to wait until I'm older to make a difference," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me that even small actions can lead to big changes." Reading those words filled Daniel with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He wasn't just honoring Thomas's legacy, he was inspiring others to create legacies of their own. Despite the accolades, Daniel remained humble, always deflecting praise onto those around him. "None of this would be possible without my mom, our team, and everyone who believes in what we're doing," he'd say during interviews. Margaret, however, knew better. She saw the late nights he spent troubleshooting designs, the weekends sacrificed to meet deadlines, and the quiet determination that carried him through setbacks. She marveled at how much he had grown, not just as an inventor or leader, but as a person. Gone was the boy who once doubted his abilities, replaced by a young man confident in his capacity to effect change. Though she missed Thomas every day, she couldn't help but feel grateful for the bond she now shared with Daniel. Their partnership had become unbreakable, forged through shared struggles and victories. The highlight of the season came when a major international organization recognized Project Lumina with an award for innovation in sustainable development. The ceremony, held in a grand ballroom in New York City, brought together changemakers from around the world. As Daniel accepted the trophy, cameras flashing and applause echoing around him, he dedicated the honor to Thomas. "My brother taught me that no dream is too big if you're willing to work for it," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. "This isn't just my achievement, it's his, and it belongs to anyone who dares to believe in a brighter tomorrow." Backstage afterward, reporters clamored for interviews, eager to capture the essence of the young innovator capturing global attention. Margaret watched from the sidelines, tears streaming down her face as she realized how far they had come since that rainy night at the cemetery. Returning home to Willow Creek, Daniel and Margaret were greeted like heroes. Friends, neighbors, and volunteers gathered at the community center to celebrate their success, filling the room with laughter, music, and food. Children ran around holding miniature replicas of the solar lamp, crafted specially for the occasion, while adults toasted to the Harpers' achievements. Amid the festivities, Daniel noticed someone standing quietly near the entrance, a man in his mid-30s wearing a worn jacket and holding a tattered notebook. Curious, Daniel approached him and struck up a conversation. The man introduced himself as Alex, a self-taught engineer from a nearby town struggling to develop affordable water filtration systems for rural areas. Inspired by Project Lumina, he hoped to collaborate and learn from their experience. Daniel immediately invited him to join their team, recognizing the value of diverse perspectives in tackling global issues. That moment underscored a truth Daniel had come to embrace. Innovation thrives when doors are opened wide. With spring approaching, preparations for the next phase of expansion intensified. The manufacturing facility was nearing completion, equipped with state-of-the-art machinery, capable of producing thousands of solar lamps per month. Marketing campaigns targeted underserved regions across the globe, emphasizing affordability, durability, and ease of use. Orders began rolling in, prompting Daniel and Margaret to hire additional staff and streamline operations. At the same time, the community garden flourished, yielding bountiful harvests that fed families and generated surplus income for local charities. What started as a tribute to Thomas had evolved into a thriving ecosystem of innovation and compassion, touching lives far beyond their small town. Yet amidst the whirlwind of activity, Daniel and Margaret never lost sight of why they started this journey. Every decision, every challenge overcome served as a reminder of Thomas's unwavering spirit. They spoke often about him, sharing memories and imagining what he might say about their progress. Sometimes, during quiet moments, Daniel would sit in Thomas's old room, flipping through his notebooks and sketchbooks. He'd trace the lines of unfinished designs, wondering how many more ideas lay dormant, waiting to be discovered. Margaret joined him occasionally, sitting quietly as they reminisced about the boy who dreamed so boldly and loved so deeply. By the time summer returned, bringing warmth and renewal to Willow Creek, Project Lumina and the community garden stood as testaments to resilience and ingenuity. Solar lamps illuminated homes in over 20 countries, providing light and hope to those living without electricity. The garden, now sprawling across several acres, had become a hub of education and empowerment, attracting visitors from neighboring towns and beyond. Daniel and Margaret looked back on the year with a mix of pride and gratitude, knowing they had created something lasting. But they also looked forward, aware that there was still much to do. Challenges loomed on the horizon, scaling production, addressing logistical bottlenecks, and navigating the complexities of international partnerships. Yet neither feared what lay ahead. They had faced uncertainty before and emerged stronger because of it. On a warm June evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Daniel and Margaret walked hand in hand through the community garden. Rows of vegetables swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves glistening with dew. In the distance, volunteers laughed and chatted as they packed crates of fresh produce for distribution. The air smelled of earth and growth, a fitting metaphor for the life they had cultivated together. Daniel paused, turning to his mother with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Thomas ever imagined all this?" he asked softly. Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "I think he did," she replied, "and I think he's proud of us." For a moment they stood silently, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, side by side, they continued walking, ready to embrace whatever the future held. As the years rolled on, the impact of Project Lumina and the community garden grew far beyond what Daniel and Margaret could have imagined. What began as a small-town effort to honor Thomas's memory had transformed into a global movement, inspiring countless others to dream bigger and act bolder. The solar lamps, now distributed in over 50 countries, illuminated homes, schools, and clinics in some of the most remote corners of the world. Stories poured in from users, children studying under their glow, families gathering for meals, without the danger of kerosene fumes, and entrepreneurs using them to power small businesses. Each story reinforced the belief that even the simplest innovations could spark profound change. For Daniel, reading these accounts was both humbling and exhilarating. He often thought about how Thomas's vision had transcended the boundaries of time and place, proving that love and creativity could ripple outward indefinitely. Margaret, too, found immense fulfillment in watching the garden flourish. It had become more than just a source of food. It was a living classroom where people learned sustainable practices and built connections with one another. Teachers brought students to explore its rows of vegetables and herbs, while volunteers swapped tips on composting and crop rotation. On weekends, the garden hosted workshops led by experts in agriculture, renewable energy, and environmental conservation. Families came together to harvest produce, cook communal meals, and celebrate the abundance they had created collectively. The sense of unity within the community deepened, with neighbors supporting one another not only in farming but also in daily life. Margaret often stood at the edge of the garden, watching the laughter and camaraderie unfold, feeling a profound gratitude for the role she played in nurturing this shared space. She no longer saw herself as merely Thomas's mother or Daniel's supporter. She was a leader, an innovator, and a beacon of hope in her own right. Daniel continued to evolve, alongside the projects, taking on increasingly complex challenges as he transitioned from a teenager into adulthood. After graduating high school, he chose to study engineering at a prestigious university, balancing his studies with managing Project Lumina's expansion efforts. His professors were impressed not only by his technical skills, but also by his ability to think creatively and empathetically. During lectures, he often referenced lessons learned from Thomas's designs, blending academic theory with real-world application. Outside of class, he collaborated with fellow students on new prototypes, experimenting with ways to make the solar lamps even more efficient and versatile. One breakthrough came when he developed a modular version that could be customized for different environments, from deserts to rainforests. The innovation earned him recognition in scientific journals and invitations to speak at international forums. Yet despite the accolades, Daniel remained grounded, always crediting Thomas for planting the seeds of inspiration. As Project Lumina gained momentum, so did its influence on other initiatives. Inspired by the success of the solar lamps and community, garden organizations around the world began adopting similar models tailored to their unique needs. In Africa, a group adapted Thomas's vertical farming techniques to combat food insecurity in urban areas. In South America, activists used his rainwater harvesting system to address water scarcity in drought-prone regions. Even in wealthy nations, communities embraced the idea of self-sufficiency, turning vacant lots into thriving green spaces. Every adaptation bore traces of Thomas's original vision, proof that great ideas could take root anywhere if nurtured with care. For Daniel and Margaret, seeing their work inspire such widespread action was both rewarding and humbling. They knew they couldn't do everything themselves, but they didn't need to. Their mission had sparked a chain reaction, empowering others to carry the torch. Despite their successes, there were moments when doubt crept in. Funding shortages occasionally threatened progress, forcing Daniel and Margaret to get creative with fundraising campaigns. Technical glitches delayed production timelines, requiring late nights troubleshooting problems. And then there were the skeptics, those who dismissed their efforts as naive idealism or questioned whether the projects could truly make a lasting impact. But each obstacle only strengthened their resolve. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from shared memories of Thomas and the knowledge that they were building something greater than themselves. "We're not just solving problems," Daniel once said during a particularly tough week. "We're proving that solutions are possible." Those words became a mantra, guiding them through every challenge they faced. One of the most poignant milestones came 5 years after the night they exhumed Thomas's grave. A documentary filmmaker revisited the Harper family to create a follow-up film chronicling the long-term impact of their work. This time, the focus wasn't just on grief and discovery, it was on legacy. Cameras captured scenes of children playing beneath solar-powered lights in rural villages, farmers tending crops grown with sustainable methods, and volunteers teaching, workshops inspired by Thomas's designs. Interviews featured beneficiaries sharing how the projects had transformed their lives, as well as collaborators explaining how they had adapted the concepts to suit their communities. At the heart of it all were Daniel and Margaret, still working tirelessly to expand the reach of Thomas's vision. When the final cut premiered, audiences were moved to tears, not by sadness, but by the sheer magnitude of what love and determination could achieve. By the decade mark, Project Lumina and the Community Garden had become household names, synonymous with innovation and sustainability. Government sought partnerships to implement the initiatives on a national scale, while corporations adopted them as benchmarks for corporate social responsibility. Universities offered scholarships in Thomas's name, encouraging young minds to pursue careers in science and engineering. Even Hollywood took notice, producing a feature film based on the Harper family's journey. Though fictionalized, the movie stayed true to the essence of their story, a testament to the enduring power of hope and resilience. Watching the premiere, Daniel and Margaret felt a mix of emotions: pride, nostalgia, and a quiet ache for the brother and son who had started it all. Through it all, Daniel never stopped thinking about Thomas. He kept his brother's notebooks close, often flipping through them for inspiration. Some pages contained sketches and calculations he had yet to decipher, while others held fragments of poetry and musings on life. Each entry reminded him of the depth of Thomas's mind and the boundless potential he possessed. "I wish you were here to see this," Daniel would whisper sometimes, running his fingers over the faded ink. Yet in many ways he believed Thomas was there. With every lamp lit, every seed planted, and every life touched, his presence lingered. Margaret, too, carried Thomas in her heart, finding comfort in the knowledge that his spirit lived on through their work. She often reflected on the journey they had taken, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the triumphs, and marveled at how much they had accomplished. Though the pain of losing him would never fully disappear, it had softened, tempered by the joy of seeing his dreams realized. She took solace in knowing that Thomas's legacy wasn't confined to memories or artifacts. It was alive in the actions of those who carried forward his vision. As they entered the second decade of their journey, Daniel and Margaret looked ahead with cautious optimism. Challenges undoubtedly lay ahead: climate change, political instability, economic uncertainty, but they were undeterred. They had faced adversity before and emerged stronger because of it. With a growing network of collaborators and supporters, they believed they could tackle whatever came their way. New projects were already in the works, including a plan to develop affordable medical devices for underserved communities and an initiative to restore degraded ecosystems using regenerative farming techniques. For Daniel, these ventures represented not just opportunities to innovate, but also chances to continue honoring Thomas's legacy. On a crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, Daniel and Margaret stood together at the edge of the community garden. Rows of vegetables stretched out before them, vibrant and lush, a testament to the hard work and dedication of everyone involved. In the distance, children laughed as they chased butterflies, their voices mingling with the rustle of leaves and chirping of birds. It was a scene of harmony and abundance, one that embodied everything Thomas had dreamed of. Daniel turned to his mother, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" he asked softly. Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Of course I do," she replied. "But I also know this: wherever we go, whatever we do, Your brother will be with us. And that's enough." With those words, they walked side by side down the dirt path, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Behind them, the garden thrived, a living symbol of resilience and renewal. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly, filled with possibilities, yet to unfold. And within them, the spirit of Thomas Harper burned brightly, a guiding light leading them toward a better tomorrow.